As you know, we've been studying from the Old Testament book of Jericho. We're now in Jericho chapter 5, so this is the sixth in this message series. Kind of an intro was the first week, and then we've gone chapter by chapter by chapter. If you want an exegetical study about a book, you need to go to Steve's class because they're uncovering Hebrews. But if you want more of an overview, then this is kind of what I'm doing and sharing with you. Little tidbits, little things that I think we can take out of this Old Testament book that give us encouragement today. Not necessarily trying to piece it all out verse by verse by verse, but more of a $30,000 or 30,000-foot overview. Our passage today is taken from Jericho chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. This picture on the overhead for you is a woman by the name of Joy Verone. And Joy Verone, for a moment, was all alone in her hospital room. She was alone with her pain. She was alone with her fears. And she was particularly alone with the memory of her SUV rolling over her body. You see, her vacation had become tragedy when her car had slipped out of gear and began rolling toward a steep Colorado mountain ravine with all three of her children inside the car. Joy and her parents were looking at some real estate that her parents were interested in buying. And when they saw the vehicle moving, they sprinted to try and stop the car. And it just so happened that Joy arrived first. And she was fearful that she didn't have time to open the driver's side door, get inside, put her foot on the brake, or put it into park, or whatever she could do. So what she decided to do is she placed herself in front of this SUV. Now, her interference happened to slow it down long enough so that her father could get in the passenger side of the SUV, apply the brake, put it in park, and bring the car to a stop. Now, this all occurred in October of 1999, so it's some time ago. But her children still remember the expression of their mother as the car is pulling her underneath its weight. Joy's back was broken, and her internal injuries were very severe. Joy was airlifted to a hospital in Farmington, New Mexico, and her condition was so fragile that doctors had to wait 12 days before they could even begin to perform surgery on Joy's broken body. She emerged eventually from the operating room with a dangerously high fever. And her medical team had struggled to get the fever under control, but for 7 days they just couldn't do it. And so Joy's fears raged. She feared dying. She feared living like a paralytic. The physicians tried to comfort her, but from Joy's perspective, there was no comfort to be found. Joy pleaded with her mom. And her mother, who had been maintaining a bedside vigil next to her daughter, stepped outside of the room to call some friends to engage them in prayer on Joy's behalf. And her mom said, "All right, Joy, I'll be back soon." So for a moment, Joy was alone, but not for long. A man opened the door and walked into her room, and Joy didn't recognize him, because all of Joy's nurses, pursuant to Joy's request, were all female. And if this man was her doctor, she didn't recognize him as being her doctor. He had a striking appearance, according to Joy. He was tall, he was dressed in white, like what the doctors would wear. He had high cheekbones and silver white hair that was parted down the middle and ran down the back into a ponytail. Maybe looked a little bit like Richard. Had piercing blue eyes, is what Joy remembers. And the visitor stepped toward her bed and lifted her chart, kind of casually flipping through it, but Joy got the distinct impression that the doctor wasn't really reading what he had open. After a few moments, he spoke to her in a really soothing voice. He said, "Joy, you're going to be all right. You'll get through this." And then as quickly as he had entered, he left. And for whatever reason, Joy instantly believed what this man had told her. When her mother re-entered the room, Joy then immediately told her about this doctor. "Mom, he said I'm going to be fine." So Joy's mom, after hearing this, runs out into the hallway to find the visitor. But she couldn't find anyone that matched his description. She then described this man to hospital staff, and they knew nothing of a man based on the description that was provided. They even searched the hospital, and they couldn't find him, and Joy knows exactly why. She believes that this visitor was heaven sent just for her, and she treasures the words that he spoke. And the years have brought lots of pain, difficulty, and life in a wheelchair for Joy. But she often turns to the memory of the ponytailed stranger who walked into her room and gave her strength. You'll get through this. And she has. So the question is, who exactly was this visitor? And from where did he come? Did God send some sort of emissary to bring her hope? Well, Joshua, the author of the book whom we are studying now, would like to weigh in on that particular question, because he has a story that parallels Joy's. It's a divine encounter during a really dark and difficult time for Joshua. Okay, he wasn't alone in a hospital like Joy, but he was alone with a challenge, because Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 says, Joshua was near Jericho. Now, of course, today all we have is remnants, so what you see on the overhead is a depiction of what Jericho likely looked like based upon archaeological discoveries and writings. But for Joshua, he knew that David had his Goliath, and Elijah had his Jezebel, and John had the whole Roman Empire, and Joshua had the people of that fortified city. You see, it towered like a titan on the barren plains just north of the Dead Sea. Successive walls encircled the houses contained within the city of Jericho. The outer wall was 7 feet wide and 16 feet high. On top of this wall, a second wall was built, and this one was 8 feet tall. A citadel guarded the north end of the city. A thick forest of palm trees, roughly 8 miles long and 3 miles wide, stood as a barrier to the east of the city. Steep walls protected the western wall. So here you have high walls, protected sides, and Joshua and his soldiers had never faced such a challenge. They had fought battles in the wilderness, yes, but they had always been fought on their turf and on their terms in the open plains. They've never attacked a city like that, ever. You see, Joshua and the approximately 2 million people that were following him had never passed this way before. And my hunch is that there are moments in your life, either past, perhaps present, and in all likelihood, in the future, things that have happened that haven't passed your way before either. Perhaps you're facing a challenge unlike any you have ever faced before. It looms on the horizon like an angry Jericho. It's imposing. It's strong. It consumes your thoughts and it saps your strength. It wakes you up and keeps you awake. It's ancient, it's thick-walled, and it is virtually impenetrable. It's the biggest challenge of your life. It sits between you and your inheritance, this promised land that we've been talking about. And like Joshua, you've got to face it. Like Joshua, you can see it. And like Joshua, you don't have to face it alone. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 14. You know, when it comes to these heaven and earth communiques that we've read through in the Bible, God seems to follow one rule, and that is there are no rules. In the case of Abram, if you remember, he entertained 3 strangers for dinner. In the story of Moses, we have a blazing bush that leaves Moses wide-eyed and barefoot. We also know that a talking donkey got the attention of Balaam, the prophet. And we also know that a blazing angel was guarding the tomb of Jesus Christ. You see, the Bible is famous for these encounters. Yet, no visit, I think, is a little bit more mysterious than this one. This man with the upraised sword and this really confident air about him. I mean, who was he? And in processing that question, I thought, well, sometimes to get to the answer, I need to eliminate other options. That's just how my mind thinks. So let me step you through some of the options that I have eliminated that I think we can. First of all, I don't think this image was just an apparition. Nothing in the language of Joshua leads us to conclude that this person was very much flesh and bone. I mean, he had muscles to hold a sword, right? And he had vocal cords that would create a voice. So I don't think that this was some sort of vision or spirit or ghost or maybe even some figment out of Joshua's fertile imagination. I don't think it was an angel either. Now, we're tempted to think so because, after all, angels, we know, have swords, right? You've read about that in the Bible. Angels can take a fleshly form. We've read about that. Angels have courage and they defy enemies. But here's the difference and why I think we can safely eliminate this being an angel. Angels don't accept worship. When the Apostle John attempted to worship an angel in Revelation chapter 19, verse 10, he was very quickly rebuked. Here's what the angel said. "See that you don't do that. I'm your fellow servant and of your brethren who have the testimony of Jesus worship God. So had this person in Joshua been an angel, he would have refused Joshua's worship. But as we know, this visitor not only accepted it, but encouraged it. So was this guest a human being? Some sort of strong, imposing figure? If he was, then he sure had Joshua bamboozled, because Joshua just fell at the person's feet out of respect and removed his sandals as he was requested. This guest, in my opinion, was no mortal. He wasn't an angel, and he wasn't an apparition. And that leaves only one option. This was God incarnate. This was Jesus Christ. What Jesus did in Bethlehem for us as we now approach the Christmas season, Jesus did in Jericho for Joshua. The commander, our commander, spoke to his commander, Joshua. And in a sense, do you find that just a little curious? Like Jesus BC? I mean, how can Jesus be Jesus BC if it's before Christ, right? But that shouldn't really surprise us. It shouldn't be that difficult to imagine that Jesus was as active before his birth as he was after. And if that does strike you as a bit challenging, then let me just give you some additional information to maybe widen your imagination. Steve is leading a class on Sunday mornings that I would encourage all of you to attend. It's very good. And Steve is a very good teacher. And in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, it says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We also know that he was chosen before the creation of the world. That's what 1 Peter tells us, chapter 1, verse 20. You see, the normal restrictions of both time and place don't apply to Jesus. We'd be wrong, I think, to limit his corporal ministry to just a 33-year period in Palestine. Long before Jesus ever ate with Zacchaeus in Jericho, he shared a moment with Joshua in that same city. And what a moment it was. Because this visitor says, I am the commander of the army of the Lord. And I think from Joshua's perspective, Joshua saw two armies, his and the army of Jericho. But you see, church, actually there was a third army. This was the Lord's army. This was God's angels. And this, I think, is the heavenly host referred to in Psalm chapter 103, verses 20 and 21. It says, bless the Lord, you mighty angels of his who carry out his orders, listening for each of his commands. Yes, bless the Lord, you armies of his angels who serve him constantly. Now, I think we can dismiss this idea of angels with these kind of chiffon kind of wings and these rosy cheeks and all playing harps. Because God's angels were strong enough to close the mouths of lions when Daniel was in the lion's den. According to the book of Revelation, it will take only one angel to bind Satan and cast him into a bottomless pit. Now, just think about that. Just one angel can dispense with Satan. So imagine what thousands of angels can do. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22 refers to thousands of angels in a joyful assembly. And when John was given a glimpse into the heavens in Revelation, He saw too many angels to even begin to count. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 11, he says, the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I think 10,000 times 10,000 is 100 million. 100 million. And that's just the beginning of what John is saying. I saw 100 million angels and thousands of thousands more. That's a lot of angels. So when God opened the eyes of Elijah, for instance, and especially Elisha's servant, this young man saw a mountain full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. That's in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 17. And we know again from the Hebrew writer, in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, angels are ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation. Their presence, church, is a promised land perk. All of God's children can be sure of God's angels. They're mighty in power. They are many in number. And guess who's their commander? The Lord that we serve. And the message to Joshua in the text that we're using as kind of the foundation of our message this morning is as follows. You know, Joshua, Jericho may have its walls, but Joshua, you have so much more. You have God. He is with you. And isn't that the word that probably Joshua needed? I mean, he is now a skilled military officer, has vanquished foes before on plains that are as far as you can see, but never confront an enemy like the people who lived in Jericho. And he's got 2 million people that are relying upon him to make good decisions because they have just crossed the Jordan into a country they've never inhabited. And if you're Joshua in the dark of your night, don't you think Joshua needed to have maybe an encouraging word? Because who else is he going to talk to? He's the commander. And if Joshua needs that kind of encouragement, isn't that what we need to? We need to know that our God is near. We need to know that we are never, ever alone. We need to know that in our darkest hour, in our deepest questions, the Lord of hosts never leaves us. So, church, you need to know this. If you didn't before, write it down today. Your heavenly Father is here. Here as the commander. Here with his heavenly hosts. You will never, ever face your Jericho alone. This is the promise God gave Joy in New Mexico, right? And Joshua near Jericho, and this is the same promise he gives to you. He's with you. He's still the commander of the hosts. In fact, Paul, in writing to the church in Ephesus, chapter 1, verse 22, says he's in charge of it all and has the final word on everything. He sustains everything by the mighty power of his command, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Only to lift a finger, and thousands upon thousands of mighty angels will respond to his call. His presence is a part of your present inheritance. The writer in Psalms chapter 16, verse 5 said, O Lord, you are the portion of my inheritance and my cup. We tend to think in earthly terms about receiving an inheritance after someone else has passed. Well, our Lord has passed and he's been raised from the dead. And so it triggers the will. We get the inheritance today. And part of what Jesus has provided to us is confidence and assurance that he is with us always. He still remains the commander of the Lord's army, and he commands 100 million angels plus thousands and thousands more. And if that's true, he will come to you in the form of a hospital companion or a holy commander. I don't know. Maybe. Or he may come through the word of a scripture, maybe even the kindness of a friend. But this much is certain: God comes to his people. In Psalm chapter 46, verse 7, it says, "The commander of the armies of heaven is here among us." And church, you're no exception to that promise. You qualify as us. His love includes all people. And isn't that kind of the point of this really curious dialogue between Joshua and Jesus? Because Joshua asks him straight out, "Are you for us or are you against us?" as they would say. And what was the answer? "Neither," the commander replied. And that's because God doesn't take sides. He's never against his children. Even if the evil Canaanites, who had long ago at this point in time turned away from worshiping their idols, they would have been candidates for his mercy. And I'm not speculating about that because we know that some of the Canaanites were saved. We talked about her. Her name was Rahab. Had Jericho turned and repented, God would have received them as he received Rahab. Because God is for his kids. He's for his children. And he's for you. And Paul, writing to the church in Rome, chapter 8, verse 31 says, if God's for you, who can be against you? So church, are you facing maybe some Jericho-level kind of challenge in your life? Are you facing walls that are maybe too high to breach or too thick to crack? Maybe you face a diagnosis, a difficulty, or a defeat that really keeps you from entering into this promised inheritance that God has given to you. If so, then do what Joshua did. In Joshua chapter 5, verse 13, it says, "When Joshua was by Jericho, what did he do? He lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him." Did you catch that, church? When Joshua lifted his eyes, he saw Jesus. And as long as our eyes are on our problems, we might just miss him. As long as our eyes are only on our Jerichos, we won't see Jesus. We've got to look up. In fact, the writer of Psalm chapter 121, verses 1 and 2 said, "I will lift up my eyes unto the hills. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth." So I think what that kind of tells us is we need to look to Jesus for that comfort. Turn your gaze away from your Jericho because you've been looking at it long enough. There's no need to memorize its circumference. There's no need to itemize all of the stones in that Jericho that you're facing. Because healing happens when we look up to our commander. Lift up your eyes and then bow your knees. It says in Joshua chapter 5, verse 14, Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped. And I wanted to just at least expand on this notion for a moment. Remember who Joshua is. Joshua was a 5-star general. We know that 40,000 soldiers saluted as they passed. His tent was like the Oval Office. 2 million people, approximately, are looking up to him. Yet, in the presence of God, he fell on his face, he removed his sandals, and he worshiped. Church, we are never so strong that we do not need to worship. That's why we're here today. Because worship-less people have no power greater than themselves to call upon, right? The worship-less heart faces his or her Jericho all by themselves. So don't go to your Jericho without first going to your commander. Let him remind you of the ever-present angels that have been provided to us as a part of our inheritance. Let him assure you of his all-encompassing power, because he has given you this promise. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. You know, your Jerichos may be strong, but Jesus is even stronger. So church, this week, as you face whatever Jericho there may be in your life, it may seem intimidating. It may seem overwhelming. It may seem too strong for you to overcome. But the Jesus whom all of you call your Lord and Savior is stronger than your Jericho. Follow him and see what he can do in your life as it relates to your challenges and your Jericho. Thank you. So we've picked this song, Just As I Am, because a lot of us feel, I think, sometimes that we have to spruce ourselves up for Jesus to like us. Kind of like going over to visit at somebody's house. You know, you want to have your hair looking nice and your body smelling clean and your pants pressed or whatever the case is, because you want the host to accept you when you arrive at the door. The cool thing about Jesus is he'll take us just like we are. You don't have to dress up for him, because you can't get dressed up enough for Jesus. He's perfect and we're not. So who are you trying to impress? I guess it'd be yourself. Well, then you just kind of need to get over yourself and just come to Jesus like you are, because he loves you. It says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So you don't need to bother dressing yourself up. You just need to answer the call, and he'll take you just as you are. Let's stand and sing.